couldn't look away. The windows, thick with grime, seemed to watch rather than be watched, and the sagging porch creaked even when there was no wind. Sarah hadn't planned to live there. She'd passed it several times during her search for a place to stay after her recent move for work. Something about the house had repelled her. Perhaps the faint smell of mildew that seemed to waft from its very walls, or the way the lawn, overgrown and wild, seemed to resist any attempts at taming. But after a week of failed leads, missed appointments, and rising desperation, the vacancy sign hanging crookedly in the window started to look less ominous and more like an opportunity. The landlord, a wiry woman in her 50s named Mrs. Abernathy, greeted Sarah with an unsettling mix of politeness and indifference. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sharp and calculating behind thick glasses. She moved through the dimly lit corridors of the house with a quiet efficiency, speaking only when necessary. "The room's on the second floor," she had said, leading Sarah up the creaking staircase. The carpet beneath their feet was faded and fraying at the edges, and the walls were adorned with outdated wallpaper that peeled in long strips. "It's small but private. The other tenants keep to themselves." Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic, like old coins. It wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't unbearable either. The room was modest, just as Mrs. Abernathy had described. A single bed with a sagging mattress, a wooden desk with one leg shorter than the others, and a small wardrobe that groaned whenever its doors were opened. The window overlooked the backyard, a tangled mess of weeds and gnarled branches that seemed to claw at the air. It wasn't much, but it was affordable, and Sarah didn't have the luxury of being picky. The first few nights were uneventful. Sarah spent her evenings unpacking her belongings, trying to make the room feel less oppressive. The other tenants were indeed quiet. She rarely saw anyone in the dim hallways or shared spaces. Occasionally, she'd hear muffled voices through the thin walls, but they were fleeting, like whispers carried on the wind. One evening, as Sarah sat at her desk, flipping through a book to distract herself from the creeping loneliness, she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, she thought it was the branches outside scraping against the window, but when she looked, the trees were still, their skeletal limbs motionless against the night sky. The tapping continued, faint but insistent, seeming to come from the wall behind her. She told herself it was nothing. Old houses made noises, she reasoned. The plumbing, the settling of wood, the scurrying of mice, all perfectly mundane explanations. But the sound persisted, growing louder as the night wore on. By midnight, it had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The next day, Sarah mentioned the noise to Mrs. Abernathy, who dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "This house has been standing for over a century," she said, her voice clipped. "It's bound to creak and groan. You'll get used to it." Sarah wasn't so sure. The tapping continued the following night, more pronounced this time. It seemed to come from different parts of the room, moving from one corner to another, as if something unseen were pacing just beyond the walls. Sleep was elusive, and when she finally drifted off, her dreams were strange and fragmented, images of dark corridors and shadowy figures that vanished the moment she turned to face them. As the days turned into weeks, the house began to feel more oppressive. The dim lighting seemed to grow dimmer, the shadows longer and darker. Sarah noticed things she hadn't before, scratches on the floorboards that didn't match the furniture, faint stains on the wallpaper that looked suspiciously like old water damage, but darker, almost reddish in hue. She tried to make conversation with the other tenants, but they were evasive, their smiles forced and fleeting. There was Mr. Holloway, a retired schoolteacher who spent most of his days reading in the corner of the common room, his eyes darting nervously toward the stairs whenever anyone entered. Then there was Elise, a soft-spoken woman in her 30s who always seemed on the verge of tears, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea. Sarah never saw her drink from it. One rainy afternoon, Sarah caught sight of an older man she hadn't seen before. He was standing in the backyard, staring up at her window. His face was pale, his expression blank, and his clothes hung off him as though he'd been wearing them for weeks. She turned away, unsettled, but when she looked back, he was gone. The unease grew stronger with each passing day. The house seemed to hum with an energy Sarah couldn't explain, a low vibration she felt in her chest rather than heard. The tapping was now accompanied by other noises, scratches, faint whispers, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor above her, even though Mrs. Abernathy insisted the attic was empty. One night, unable to sleep, Sarah decided to explore the house. She crept down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The air was thick and stale, and she felt a strange resistance, as though the house itself didn't want her wandering. She stopped outside a door she hadn't noticed before. It was unmarked, the paint peeling away to reveal splinters of raw wood beneath. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. The whispers she'd heard before seemed louder now, emanating from beyond the door. She pressed her ear against it, her breath caught in her throat. "Help me," a voice whispered, so faint she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. But the voice came again, clearer this time. "Please, don't leave me." Sarah froze, her ear pressed against the cold, splintered wood of the door. The voice was so faint, almost indistinguishable from the creaking of the house, yet it carried a weight that chilled her to her core. Her mind scrambled for rational explanations. Maybe it was one of the other tenants playing a prank, or perhaps her exhaustion was warping her senses. But deep down, she knew neither was true. The voice had sounded desperate, human. Her hand trembled as it hovered over the doorknob. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to retreat, to return to the safety of her room and forget she'd ever heard anything. But a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps guilt, pushed her forward. She grasped the knob, its surface icy to the touch, and turned it slowly. The door creaked open an inch, revealing only darkness beyond. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. No response. The air that seeped through the crack smelled stale, with an underlying metallic tang that reminded her of old blood. She wrinkled her nose and leaned forward, peering into the black void. The whispers had stopped, leaving a heavy silence that seemed to press down on her like a physical weight. She took a step back, her courage faltering. The darkness beyond the door felt unnatural, like it was swallowing the weak light from the hallway. Her mind conjured images of hidden things lurking just out of sight, waiting for her to step inside. Before she could close the door, a sound stopped her. A faint shuffling noise, like bare feet sliding across a wooden floor. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sent a surge of adrenaline through her veins. She backed away, her breath hitching as her eyes remained fixed on the open door. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Sarah let out a startled gasp, her hand flying to her chest. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the uneven carpet. For a moment, she stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open again. But nothing happened. The silence returned, oppressive and unbroken. She retreated to her room, locking the door behind her with trembling hands. Her mind raced, replaying what had just happened. She wanted to believe it was a trick of the old house, an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion and voice had been real. She was certain of it. The following day, Sarah tried to act as if everything was normal. She went to work, attended her meetings, and even forced herself to smile at her coworkers. But the events of the previous night lingered in her mind, a shadow she couldn't shake. By the time she returned to the boarding house, the thought of stepping inside filled her with dread. The house felt different, as though it had grown darker in her absence. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. She avoided the unmarked door as she climbed the stairs, refusing to even glance in its direction. But she couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching her, tracking her every movement. In her room, she tried to distract herself with a book, but her eyes kept darting to the corners, where the shadows seemed to writhe and twist like living things. The tapping started again, soft and rhythmic, coming from the same spot behind her desk. She clenched her fists, determined to ignore it. But as the hours passed, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the walls themselves were alive, pulsing with the sound. By midnight, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and moved the desk away from the wall. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing cracked plaster beneath. She ran her fingers over the surface, searching for anything out of place. Her hand paused when she felt a faint indentation, a square outline that didn't match the rest of the wall. With a mix of fear and determination, she dug her nails into the edges of the indentation, peeling back the plaster. Beneath it, she found a small wooden panel, nailed shut. The wood was old, discolored, and brittle, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Her flashlight flickered as she pried the nails loose, her heart racing with every creak of the wood. When the panel came free, she was met with a narrow, dark space that smelled of mildew and decay. She shone her flashlight inside, revealing a small, hollow cavity. At first, it seemed empty, but then she saw it. A small bundle wrapped in cloth, stained and tattered with age. She hesitated before reaching inside, her fingers trembling as she pulled the bundle out. Unwrapping it, she found a collection of objects: an old rusted locket, a faded photograph of a woman with sad eyes, and a brittle piece of paper covered in spidery handwriting. The words were barely legible, but she could make out a single sentence repeated over and over. "Forgive me." As she stared at the items, a chill ran down her spine. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a faint scratching sound coming from within the walls. It was subtle at first, but it grew louder, more frantic, as though something was trying to claw its way out. Sarah's breath quickened. She stuffed the items back into the cavity, shoving the panel into place. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural silence that made her skin crawl. She pushed the desk back against the wall, as if the weight of the furniture could somehow keep whatever was behind it contained. The rest of the night passed in a haze of sleepless paranoia. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the house setting her nerves on edge. When dawn finally broke, she felt no relief, only the oppressive certainty that the house wasn't done with her yet. The next few days passed in a blur of unease and sleepless nights. Sarah felt the weight of the house pressing down on her, its silence no longer comforting but suffocating. The other tenants seemed more distant than ever, their fleeting glances and terse nods doing little to dispel the growing sense of dread. Even Mrs. Abernathy, always aloof, now seemed tense, her movements sharp and hurried, as though she wanted to spend as little time in the house as possible. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. In her room, she felt eyes on her back whenever she sat at her desk. In the hallways, the faint creak of floorboards behind her made her whip around, only to find emptiness. Even in the shared spaces, where the dim light cast long shadows, she sensed a presence just out of sight, lurking beyond the edges of her vision. The tapping had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was worse. It was the kind of silence that hummed in her ears, growing louder the more she tried to ignore it. And then, the dreams began. They started as fragments, images of dark corridors, whispered voices, and the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the reach of her flashlight. Each night, the dreams grew more vivid. She would wake drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, with the distinct impression that she wasn't alone in the room. Once, she awoke to find the locket from the cavity sitting on her desk, its tarnished chain coiled like a snake. She had locked it away in a drawer days before. Sarah didn't remember moving it. She was sure she hadn't. One night, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere of her room, she ventured into the hallway. The air was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into her bones and made her breath visible. The house was eerily still, the faint hum of electricity the only sound. She wandered aimlessly, her footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet, until she found herself standing outside the unmarked door. The memory of the voice came rushing back, and for a moment, she considered turning around and retreating to her room. But something drew her closer, a pull she couldn't explain. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough surface of the door. It felt colder than the air around it, as though it were holding something frozen within. Before she could stop herself, she tried the knob. It didn't budge. She pressed her ear against the door, listening for any sound, but there was only silence. As she pulled away, her flashlight flickered, casting strange, wavering shadows along the hallway walls. And then she saw it, a handprint, faint and smudged, appearing on the door as though pressed from the inside. Her breath hitched, and she stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The handprint was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind an unblemished surface. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was on the other side, waiting. She fled back to her room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. But even there, she found no solace. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows in the corners growing darker and more defined. She could almost see shapes within them, faces, twisted and grotesque, staring back at her. That night, sleep didn't come. She sat huddled on the bed, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. The hours dragged on, and just as the first light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the curtains, she heard it again. The scratching. It was faint at first, like fingernails lightly grazing wood, but it grew louder, more frantic, until it sounded as though something were clawing desperately at the walls. The sound came from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. The noise seemed to vibrate through her very bones, relentless and unyielding. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah lowered her hands, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The room felt heavier, the air thick with an unplaceable tension. She turned her flashlight toward the desk, half expecting to see the locket or the photograph. But the desk was empty. The relief was short-lived. A sudden chill swept through the room, extinguishing the weak light of her flashlight. She fumbled with the switch, shaking it in frustration, but the beam refused to return. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the pale light of dawn. It was a woman, her outline faint and flickering like an old film reel. Her face was obscured, her features blurred and indistinct, but her presence was undeniable, a cold, oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stood there, her head tilted slightly, as though watching Sarah. Sarah's voice caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The figure stepped forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. As she approached, Sarah could make out more details. Her hollow eyes, the gaunt sunken cheeks, and the faint impression of a deep wound at her throat. The figure stopped at the foot of the bed, her empty gaze fixed on Sarah. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the room filled with an unbearable tension. And then, the woman raised a hand, pointing toward the door. Sarah's paralysis broke, and she scrambled off the bed, her back pressed against the far wall. She didn't know what the woman wanted, but the silent command in her gesture was unmistakable. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for the door, her fingers fumbling with the lock. She glanced back, but the figure was gone, leaving only the faint scent of decay in her wake. As the door creaked open, Sarah hesitated. The hallway beyond was pitch black, the usual dim light replaced by an unnatural void. She took a step forward, her heart hammering in her chest. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, the sound echoing unnaturally. From somewhere deep within the house, she heard a voice, soft, almost melodic, calling her name. It was a whisper, yet it carried through the air with a clarity that made her skin crawl. She didn't recognize the voice, but it felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain, as though it had been haunting her dreams all along. With each step she took, the voice grew louder, more insistent, guiding her